Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our early morning LEMDO webinar series. Our topic today is annotations. This is the editorial webinar. We'll be following up in 2 weeks with the technical webinar on how to create annotations. My name is Janelle Jenstad. I'm the professor of English at the University of Victoria. I'm also the conceptor and director of LEMDO and the coordinating editor of the digital Renaissance editions, Moemo Merrill shows, and the new Internet Shakespeare editions, along with other people. At the moment, I've been working on the text of Heywood's The Golden Age and making notes for future annotations as I go. I'm working on that text with Cameron Sterling, who is on the call today. We like to begin talks in a good way at the University of Victoria by acknowledging the territories that we are living and working on. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wet'suwet'en peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Our plan for today is that we're going to talk about the types of annotation that LEMDO allows and encourages, with examples from editions that are published and in preparation. Then I'm going to show you what those annotations look like in the digital and print interfaces. We'll talk a bit about the audiences that we can imagine writing our annotations for. And finally, we'll talk about the purpose of annotation. We have some people on the call who are experienced editors. So if you have thoughts to contribute, they would be particularly welcome at that point in the webinar. You are free to ask questions as we go along, either by unmuting yourself and jumping in, or by making comments in the chat. Navarra will monitor the chat and let me know that there is a question there. We'll also have a bit of time at the end of the webinar if you prefer to save your questions until then. So let's get started with types of annotations. LEMDO allows for 7 types of annotations. The 4 main annotation types are the gloss, the commentary note, the textual note, and the lineation note. These are pretty standard for editions. We also have lexical notes, pedagogical notes, and performance notes, which are less commonly used, but available to you if you want to use them and your anthology lead wants you to use them. So one person on this call, David Swain, is used to the old ISE system, and other people who might be watching the video later will also be wondering how the LEMDO annotation types correlate with the ISE levels. So here's a table that just sets out how they relate to each other. For the ISE, there were levels, 1, 2, 3. And then late in the game, the ISE added a performance type of annotation, which was at the time only used by the Queen's Men editions because they were doing performances research exercises. They had a performance editor who was adding annotations about what they had discovered in the process of performance. So the ISE level 1 note is exactly the same as the LEMDO gloss. The ISE level 2 and 3 notes, which were really distinguished only by length. So the level 2 commentary note was not very long. The level 3 commentary note was much longer, and editors were told to think about that as something that might be printed on a full page in the printed edition. For LEMDO, we distinguish notes not by length, but by their purpose and the type of thing that they're annotating. So the ISE level 2 and 3 notes in the LEMDO environment become commentary notes, textual notes, lexical notes, and lineation notes. We also have a performance annotation type, It can be used in any edition, provided the anthology lead wants those performance notes. And I can say that the new Internet Shakespeare editions and the Moemel mayoral shows and digital Renaissance editions all want those kinds of notes. We've added a new note type, the pedagogical note, which had no equivalent in the ISE. So I'll talk about each of those things in turn and give you some examples about how they work. So the gloss is exactly what you would expect. It is a short note that gives a synonym, a definition, or a modern equivalent. Here is an example from Galatea of a gloss that offers the user a synonym. I willingly attend, says Galatea, and the editor has glossed that as listen. Here's a definition, also from Galatea, being almost equal with the skies, and the gloss is having previously reached nearly to the sky. I think David Bevington wrote that one. And here is a gloss where the editor offers a modern equivalent. In this case, I wrote the gloss. So the first named of the violet, that's not a modern usage. So the gloss is after, the first city is named after the violet. I think we're all pretty familiar with those types of annotations. One category of gloss that is not short is the translation. So whenever there's foreign language text in your edition, you need, as editor, to translate it for the reader. So however long the passage is, it needs to be fully translated in your edition. Sometimes some commentary is warranted. Okay, so commentary notes can be quite a bit longer. Our definition calls them longer notes. Longer than a gloss is what we mean, that discuss the meaning of the text, roughly equivalent to annotations in editions like the Arden or New Cambridge. So this is our most capacious category, and you can be as discursive as you need to be in that commentary note. We'll come back to these because this is where you have the most freedom to express your opinion with respect to the text and summarize what is happening in the conversation around the text. But here are a few examples for now. So sometimes a commentary note will provide additional information. For a muse of fire. We all know what fire is. We don't need a gloss on that. But there's information that an early modern audience or reader would have had that maybe a modern reader or playgoer wouldn't have. And so we get this additional information about fire as being one of the four elements. It's the lightest of the four elements and thus the most likely to ascend. So that helps to make sense of a later word choice in the line, the choice to use the word ascend. Commentary notes can also include quotations. So this is also from Henry V, James Murdoch's edition. Scaffold gets a commentary note. It also gets a gloss. So you can see in this case that there's the two notes in the encoding, as Navarre is going to show you in 2 weeks. They'll be separate, but we display them together. So scaffold is first glossed as stage, and then there's a commentary note. And in this case, the editor has recognized that the best commentary note is actually one that was written by another person, and so it's quoted in full with a citation that links to the bibliographical details of that particular source. LEMDO does not indicate the setting or the implied setting for a scene, but sometimes it is helpful for the reader to know early on where a scene is meant to be taking place. In that case, the editor can add a commentary note on the scene division. Okay, so location, the royal court. According to Shakespeare's historical sources, the setting of the first act should be, and then you see another quotation with a reference pointing to bibliographical details. You can also point to other parts of your own text. So this is a good example of that. Often we don't even discover where we are on stage until we're a few lines in, or maybe a few speeches in. So the editor is pointing to the evidence in the play that tells us where this action is meant to be taking place. So the point there is that you can point to other parts of your text in the annotations. Textual annotations explain textual decisions that were made in the present and previous editions. So you'll often pair those with a collation, which we've already talked about. So if you depart from the most recent edition, if you go back to an earlier edition, you'll often want to explain why you did that, what your rationale is for that, and you'll have a collation that will show users what you've done and how that compares to previous editions. A textual note can also explain the differences between early publications. So we do copy text editions. You'll base your modern text on, the folio or the quarto or a particular quarto, and you'll have rationalized that in the textual essay in your critical paratext. But it's often really useful to point to key differences between those early publications, even if you're taking only one of them as your copy text, especially for really famous textual cruxes like Sallied, Solid, and Hamlet. So you can add a note, letting readers know that this is what this other text says. There are occasions where you might even depart from your copy text. You might think that ultimately Q1 is a better text, but on this particular point, Q2 offers a correction that you want to include in your edition. So you would collate that, but then your textual note would also give a justification for that departure from your copy text. So here's an example of a textual note from Mark Caitler's edition of London's Tempe. These characters are working at the anvil. Their habit are waistcoats and leather aprons. And so the editor, Mark Caitler, explains what Fritz and Bowers has done. Bowers has amended the word to read habits. However, given the OED's definition of habit, and that all the Cyclops wear the same articles of clothing, I find it more suiting to retain the spelling of habit, okay, despite the lack of agreement between the subject and its verb, okay? And then the note concludes with a look back at a 19th century edition by Fairhold, okay? So our editor has chosen not to accept an emendation by the only recent editor of this text, and then has gone on to justify their decision to retain the quarto reading, and drawn on Fairhold as an authority in that case. Okay, pedagogical notes. These offer teaching tips and strategies, often with links to pedagogical materials. I don't actually have any to show you because we haven't entered any into the system yet, but we do have some pedagogical notes written by Jeremy Ehrlich, who was education director at the Folger for a number of years. So I've got a note on the slide that they can be added by someone other than the main or original editor, and that is exactly the case with Jeremy's notes. So, as we develop teaching materials to go along with LEMDO editions in our classrooms, especially plays that haven't had much of a history in the classroom before, we can add these things to the texts, and their intended audience is really the instructor or professor or high school teacher who might be looking for some teaching tips, because you can't order up one of the many books on teaching Shakespeare when your author is Haywood, right? So we want to build those into the edition. If you have ideas as you're going, you're certainly welcome to add them yourself, but know that you don't have to do that. we can loop back later and add them to a future release of your edition. Performance notes can do three things, but overall they're meant to describe performance or production choices in specific productions. What they're not meant to do is to allow you to start directing the play. We're going to leave the theater practitioners to direct the play, but we can cite the work that has been done in performance, because that is a form of literary criticism. Theater practitioners have ideas about the play that they realize through their actors' movements, through lighting, through sets, through blocking, all kinds of things. So if you have been fortunate enough to have seen a production or worked with theater practitioners in the process of preparing your edition, you can describe what happened in those productions in productions that are listed in our production database. So we have a bibliography of productions that we talk about in our editions. You can also describe choices in productions that are cited in your performance essay, so your stage history essay. If your play doesn't have much of a performance history, you might simply tuck that into the general introduction. And or made in productions that were part of the editorial process. So looking ahead, that is precisely what we're applying to do with our next SSHRC partnership grant. We're looking to work with theater practitioners to help us edit plays that do not have an editorial tradition or very limited editorial tradition. We want to get these plays up on their feet and discover what we can about them using the experience and the wisdom and talent of our colleagues in the theater. And if that's the case, you really want to be learning from them and capturing their discoveries and your observations as you watch them work with the play in these performance notes. So here are two examples of performance notes from the Queen's Men edition. So the note on the right here is the performance note on the word malcontented in a stage direction. So they've added a picture. You can add images to your annotations. The stock image of the malcontented melancholy lover would have been instantly recognizable to an Elizabethan audience. Let me get an example from As You Like It. And finally, since our Prince Edward's melancholy is the premise of the opening scene, the company devised means to make it apparent to their modern audience. And so we need the picture because it shows us what the playing company decided to do in order to establish visually that this character is a malcontent. Here we have another note from a different point in the play. Before answering, Hopkins released a mournful sigh to further establish his status as a conventional melancholy lover. The usual laugh at this point I took as a sign that the company had successfully established the Elizabethan convention. Okay, so at this point, the performance editor is actually drawing in evidence from audience reaction. So that was kind of an interesting thing. It's not, the performance is of course not just about the actors and the creatives, it's also about the people in the room who are engaging with the play. Since we don't have much evidence of response from the early modern period, the response from our contemporary audience can be interesting. Lexical notes. A lexical note discusses the etymology of a word or phrase and or its meaning and prevalence in the early modern period. So I will be the first to admit that I love a deep dive into the Oxford English Dictionary, and that I'm often quite indulgent and self-indulgent when I write lexical notes because I'm interested in how words and phrases came to be what they are. I think it can be really important with some plays particularly Shakespeare, because he's often credited with having invented words and phrases. Of course, we know that he didn't invent nearly as many words as we thought. If you look at the Shakespeare's Language Project from the University of Lancaster, they have determined that he really only invented about 400 words, which is considerably fewer words than the 2,000 that have been attributed to him in other contexts. So if you are editing Shakespeare, it's useful to point out that a word or phrase had a prior history and that it shows up in this particular text in EBO TCP, and that contra the Oxford English Dictionary. This is not the first usage of that. You can also use a lexical note to talk about the meaning of a term and its prevalence in the early modern period. So if you're familiar with lexicons of early modern English, LEMI, you'll know that it is a collection of lexicons from the early modern period. They can be really helpful in establishing whether or not a word was considered to be a hard word, so a new word in the early modern period that people wouldn't know, or whether or not it was a common word. And sometimes those things are the opposite of what they are today. So a word that would have been hard and new in the early modern period is well known to us today. One example is the word tyrant, which is relatively new in the 1590s, but is of course well known to us now. And conversely, there are words that have dropped out of use or changed in meaning that would have been well known in the early modern period. So it's good to be able to flag that for readers. Here's an example of a lexical note. I think this is from Mark Caitler's edition of London's Tempe, changeable silk mantle. And the note dives into the Oxford English Dictionary and LEMI in order to explain what changeable means. Okay, I won't read the note. I'll just point out that we have citations from the Oxford English Dictionary. We can also make links to the lexicons of early modern English. We have ways of doing that that are well documented in our documentation. So you are free to cite from all the dictionaries in LEMI, and we encourage you to do that. So one way of getting around what's often called the OED loop. What is really important is that you talk to your anthology lead about which annotation types to use, the style of annotations for your anthology, and the length. So LEMDO is designed to support multiple possibilities. LEMDO doesn't require that you use all of them, nor do we tell you how to use them. That really should be coming from the editorial guidelines for your project. Now, if I put on my co-coordinating editor hat, I can tell you that the NISE, DRE, and Moemel mayoral shows welcomes all 7 types of annotations. Okay, do we have any questions in the chat so far?
No questions. I've put in links to LEMI and LEMDO's documentation for citing LEMI.
Thank you, Navarro. All right, so let's talk about what happens to our annotations in the digital interface. So I'm going to work with Mark Caitler's edition of London's Tempe. And note first that we have made some changes. So the editions that we have already, or anthologies rather, that we've already released have a particular thing happening in the interface, and we have actually made some changes. So when we re-release those editions, the annotations will look a little bit different. So here are some screen captures. This is the original LEMDO interface. We used underlining to mark things, which was a practice that we continued from the Internet Shakespeare Editions platform. We wanted to emulate what they had done in that case. There were various challenges with that. Overlapping annotations were starting to get messy. And it wasn't always clear how many things were being annotated. There might be a single underline masking the fact that there were actually 4 or 5 annotations there. So we have gone back to the drawing board and rethought, and this is what we're doing now. The new interface has a little icon that you can click on to go to the annotation. I'm going to go to the live site and show you what happens when we hover over those annotations, and I'll show you a few things about the way this interface works. So this is the edition page for London's Tempe. This is the beta site for the next release of the Mom's Anthology. So the annotations are pinned to the modern text. It's not impossible to annotate a semi-diplomatic transcription, but most of our annotations are going to be pinned to the modern text. So if we want to see the annotations, they're turned on by default, but you can also turn them off. And if you've turned them off, you want to know how to turn them back on again. The menu on the left here, we call it the slide out menu. You'll hear menus like that, sometimes called a hamburger menu, because they've got those 3 lines: bun, meat, bun. If we click on the hamburger menu, we'll get this slide out menu. The default view is the contents view with the characters, and then in this case, the headings from the divisions in the text. If it's a more conventional play with scenes or with acts and scenes, it's those act scene numbers that will show up on the contents. To turn the annotations on and off, you go to the tools menu. And at this point, we have 2 things that you can check or uncheck. So I'm going to turn off the collations right now just to keep things tidy. Our long-term plan is to give users the opportunity to turn annotation types on or off. So if somebody just wants the glosses, they can do that. So what happens when you click on the annotation icon is that the text that's being annotated is highlighted and the color of the text changes. So you can see at a glance what it is that you're getting an annotation of. So if you hover over that one, you discover that it's an annotation on the person's name. If you hover over this one, you can see that it's that whole string of Latin text. Okay, so that can help people decide if they even want to click. Here's quite a long piece of text that's being annotated. We'll click on this one. You can see there's the Latin translation that I showed you on an example screen. This is a commentary note. This is a bit of information about the person. Here's a fairly long piece of text being annotated. This is probably a commentary note. That's probably a commentary note. That too would be a commentary note. So that's how they work. If you click on the icon at the bottom of the annotation, you go directly back to the text, which is handy because if you scroll down through the text, the annotation that you had open stays open. If you want to go back to that point, probably the point you were reading, you can just click on that button. We do still have some underlining in the text, but it's now serving a different purpose. So if you click on an underlined link, you actually go to an external website. So in this case, a lot of the annotations go to the map of early modern London because we didn't want to duplicate the efforts that we'd made on that project. Another thing that you can do is view all of the annotations in one single file. So this was a feature request from peer reviewers. They wanted to be able to see all the annotations in one place. And we agreed that it's important for peer reviewers and editors and users to be able to see all the annotations at once. If you're working with a printed book, you can flip through and you can see how many annotations are at the bottom of the page and get a sense of the richness of an edition. It's hard to do that in a digital edition. You'd have to click on every single note to get a sense of that. So we decided to spin out all the notes in its own interface here, their own interface here. So here they all are. There's our Latin translation again. And if you click on the icon, you can actually go to the text that's being annotated. You have to use your back browser button to get back to this page. We would like to put in an scene speech reference at some point, but we haven't done that yet. So that can be very helpful for proofreading. It's good for peer reviewing. And I think it's important for editors also, especially when they go up for tenure, to be able to show the richness of what they have contributed to the project. Okay, so takeaways from having looked at the digital interface. Annotations are pinned to the modern text. They can be turned on and off via the tools in the slide out menu. Hovering over an annotation icon generates an underline and also a change of color. The change of color may not be the case in all the anthologies. Navarra would know better than I about that.
I believe that it is the default.
Okay, thank you. A click generates a pop-up, and that pop-up stays until you click the X to make it go away, or you click on another annotation, in which case it replaces the first pop-up. You can click on an icon in the annotation to jump to the text being annotated, and the annotations are also readable as a whole from the edition page. I wanted to show you our print interface as well. So this is a sample page from the opening chorus of Henry V. Those icons get transformed into numbers for the printed page. And so obviously there's nothing to click, but it guides you to the bottom of the page where you will see the notes. There's the note that we looked at, the lightest of the four elements, and thus the most likely to ascend. If we have time, I can give you a preview of the print edition at the end of the webinar. So it's not the case that all of the annotations appear in both the digital interface and the print interface. We've had to make some judicious decisions about what to put in the printed book so that it's affordable to print and it's usable by the user. We didn't want the page to be completely overwhelmed by volumes and volumes of annotations. So by default, all the glosses show up in the digital edition and the print edition. And by default, all of the commentary notes show up in the digital and print edition. However, we do not put textual notes, lineation notes, lexical notes, and pedagogical notes in the print edition. They are digital only. We're calling the print edition series LEMDO Hornbooks. So a hornbook, as you probably know, is the earliest text that a school child would use. We are imagining the print editions as being the first edition that somebody would use for one of these plays. And as they come to want more information, they will come to the digital edition to consult the textual notes. And likewise, the collations don't show up in the print edition. For performance notes, we have said that it depends on the anthology. We have not started the process of doing a print edition of a QME play. But I know that when we do that, we will have to have a conversation with them about where the performance notes are going to go. Their editorial methodology sees the work of the textual editor and the performance editor as being equal and complementary. So it wouldn't make sense for that particular editorial approach to exclude the performance notes. The caveat is that digital annotations can be as long as you want, within reason. You always want to think about your reader. How much information do they need? How much information are they willing to read of all of the research that you've done? But the print annotations we have capped at 255 characters. So it's often the case that a digital commentary note is longer than 255 characters. When we start generating the galleys for the print text, we actually replace commentary notes that are longer than 255 characters with a message that reads overlong note. Now, I didn't have a single example because Navarra and our editors have done such a fantastic job of cutting down the notes. So we don't actually have any overlong notes at the moment in any of our print galleys. The challenge there is to take that long digital annotation and prepare a print-only version of it. Navarra will show you in 2 weeks how that actually happens in your XML file. But let me show you what that might look like. So again, this is Henry V. In the digital interface, we have a fairly long commentary note. It is glossing blood, famine, and fire, blood, and fire in Henry V. Traditional tools of war, perhaps suggested here by Holinshed's Blood, Fire, and Famine. See also 1 Henry VI, where Talbot threatens Bordeaux with my 3 attendants, lean famine, quartering steel, and climbing fire. Great information to have. It's great to know that Shakespeare's drawing on Holinshed. It's good to know that there's some intertextual borrowing happening, maybe from one of Shakespeare's early plays to one of his later plays. But that's longer than 255 characters, and it is arguably more than the user of the print edition needs. And so we have a shorter version of that note for the print edition. And it's often the case that you just can use the first sentence or the first phrase of your longer digital commentary note. In other cases, they need to be rewritten a little bit. So that's part of the editorial labor as you're moving towards the end of your edition, is to prepare short versions of some of your longer commentary notes for the print edition. Okay, so let's move on to audiences unless there are any questions.
None in the chat.
All right, audiences. So who are we writing annotations for? One of the interesting opportunities that we have with LEMDO editions is thinking about lots of different user groups. So as we all know, a Shakespeare play will be edited in multiple different ways in multiple different series for multiple different audiences, and Shakespeare editions can afford to specialize and target themselves at very particular user groups. But for a LEMDO play, especially in the Digital Renaissance Editions anthology, some of our editions are going to be the only edition ever. Certainly the first edition in a long time, or the first edition ever, and it may be that there never will be another edition of that play other than ours. So we need to think about all potential user groups. We generally say that we're pitching our commentary notes at a 3rd year English undergraduate student. But we're also reaching out to high school and middle school teachers, and we're also reaching out to graduate students. So the first user of this edition of the Golden Age that Cameron and I are preparing is actually a graduate class at UBC. So, we want to kind of imagine maybe our most frequent user as the third year undergrad, but it's like a bell curve, and there's a very long tail on either side of our midpoint. So middle school students, high school students, graduate students could also be using these editions. We're also targeting instructors because we do want to expand the canon. We do want our text to be used in the classroom. And some of these texts will not have been taught to those instructors when they were students. So they're going to be learning about this text in order to teach it to their students, or explore it with their students would be a better wording there. So we usually think about instructors as being people like us, and the average LEMDO editor is working in the Anglo-American tradition in an English department, sometimes a theater department, but our text could be used by other instructors. We are thinking about instructors in the global South. What kinds of devices are they going to be working on? What kind of network bandwidth will they have? We at LEMDO are thinking about those things, but you as editors can be thinking about what they might need. So there are some terms that may need a gloss because they might not be known outside the Anglo-American English tradition. So be sensitive to the fact that our users may be working in one of the many global Englishes, and those Englishes have evolved in different ways. So think about how early modern English is going to land in other parts of the world. Oops. Scholars are also going to be using these editions, which is why we provide the opportunity to do a full collation, not just of changes to the text over time, but also print variants for plays that have never had a proper collation of press variants. Editors sometimes want to do those if they've been able to go and see lots of different texts. Our users also include theater practitioners, especially if we get the grant we're applying for. The first users of our text are going to be actors, directors, and creatives in the theater who are working with us to realize these texts on the stage. So keeping those user groups in mind, let's move on to talk about the purpose of annotation. And I have thoughts about the purpose of annotation, but Elizabeth and David, if you want to jump in and share some of your thinking as editors, it would be great to hear what you have done and what you're fretting about. So I'm going to give you first 3 slides that I've presented before about the purpose of annotations, but I'm going to be really upfront and say that I've come from a really fantastic symposium at the Folger Institute, led by Rory Loughlin, Catherine Richardson, Brandy Adams, and I'm missing one, Claire Bourne, about editing Marlowe and Shakespeare. And the conversation evolved in such a way that we found ourselves really talking quite a bit about annotation, among other things, but annotation really dominated the conversation, and we talked long and deeply about what annotation was for. So after I've gone through these next 3 slides, I want to start to interrogate what it is that we're doing when we annotate. So, traditionally, one of the purposes of annotation is to gloss words and phrases for the student user to make sure they understand what the text actually says. And we do that work in the gloss. Another purpose is to offer commentary and point our users usually scholars, instructors, and students to resources and criticism. And that happens in our commentary notes, which work coordinately with our bibliography and sometimes link out to other digital resources. A third function of annotation is to acknowledge our sources in ways that the collation cannot accommodate. So the collation will track what has happened in other texts, but there's not much capacity in the collation to offer a rationale or a commentary on why things have changed or why you've departed from a particular tradition or your copy text. So that work can happen in the commentary notes. It can happen in the textual notes. It can happen in the lexical notes. It can probably happen in the performance notes as well, and the pedagogical notes. So the next block of annotation types are really talking about the text. So we use our textual notes to discuss points of textual history. We expect that scholars are going to be interested in those. We hope that students will be interested in those. It probably depends on their instructor and where the instructor leads them in the course of the semester. But theater practitioners are also often interested in the text, and there is a tradition of theater practitioners really venerating the early texts. As editors, we have a lot of knowledge about print history, and we can help to contextualize some of those things. And it may be that in performance, a theater company wants to choose a different reading than we did as editors. So maybe we need to make those available. We also use our textual notes to justify where we have departed from copy text. We know that students will be interested in those. We think that theater practitioners will be interested in those occasionally. We hope that students will be interested, but again, I think that really depends on the instructor pointing students to those things. I like to do it in the classroom because I am an editor. I also like to do it because it empowers students to interact with the text in a way that they might not otherwise. They need to know that the editor has shaped the text for them, that the editor has made choices. I think that can be empowering for students who then see that the text is fluid, that it is not authoritative and fixed, that they too might make interventions in the text and offer new readings of the text. We use textual notes to contextualize our emendations and situate them ideologically. So we certainly do that for scholars. And we also need to do it for students and instructors. So my favorite example is the kisses and sighs, crux and Othello. If you're going to choose kisses over sighs or sighs over kisses, you are making an ideological claim about what you think was possible on the early modern stage, what you think is appropriate for an early modern woman and man. You might be offering a commentary on miscegenation. Early editors have done those things without necessarily being aware that they were doing those things, or being aware but choosing not to share their rationale. We need to offer a rationale for those things. And you also might comment on relineation. I very much doubt that our students are going to be super interested in relineation, although you never know. Scholars certainly will be. And theater practitioners will often work with the lines the way they're set out on the page. So if you're editing verse, you've probably spent a lot of time counting in your head or tapping on your desk, trying to figure out where you should break the lines. And in some plays, the compositor has done a great job, and in other plays, you do have to do a bit of reworking. All right, so the last of the 3 slides, you want to record performance histories and discoveries in your performance notes. And you might want to provide pedagogical guidance to instructors. And so far, we haven't been doing that in a heavy-handed way, but we recognize that there aren't a lot of resources out there for some of these plays. And so if the editor has experimented in the classroom, or a subsequent instructor has experimented with your edition in the classroom and noticed that particular moments in the play really lend themselves to discussion, experimentation, on your feet performance exercises, we're trying to provide some guidance for people to find a way into these texts. Okay, so let's trouble that a little bit. One of the things I've been thinking about for a really long time, I gave a paper in 2013 called In Praise of Opacity, in response to editorial guidelines that called for clarity. It is not the case that every text would be perfectly clear to the early modern reader or playgoer. And yet, a lot of editorial guidance suggests that we have to make every aspect of the text completely clear. Do we really need to make every aspect of a text completely clear to a modern reader if it would not have been clear to early modern playgoers or readers? So I think The Alchemist is a great example because you have lots of long speeches that are absolutely full of complicated, apparently technical terminology. And I have made the mistake of trying to explain that in class from time to time. It never works. I've looked at editions that try to explain all that. But put yourself in the shoes of Abel Drugger or Little Dapper or Epicure Mammon. They don't understand what this pseudo alchemist is saying. And that's precisely the point. It's supposed to be kind of a wall of words. So I think that we can think about doing different things with our annotations other than making things completely clear. We can try to explain how this would have landed for an early modern playgoer. We can, explain the relationship between the two interlocutors in the dialogue, the one person who is claiming knowledge for the purpose of obfuscating or demonstrating power or intimidating, and then the other person who is not meant to understand, is meant to be intimidated. So think about how language can generate power dynamics in relationships and try to make that clear to our readers rather than making every single word clear. This came up at the Folger a number of times. We discussed how certain we need to be as editors, how authoritative we need to be. And we wondered if it would be possible to pose questions, or actually say that we don't know. We've all worked with editions where we've read a line that didn't really make sense, even to us as experienced scholars of early modern texts, and not understood what we're saying, and the editor didn't provide a gloss. They not provide a gloss because it's supposed to be completely obvious to us. That makes me doubt myself as a senior scholar. How is a student going to feel? If the line is genuinely unclear, difficult to resolve, what if we say to our students, this passage is not clear? Nobody has shed light on it. And just be honest about the fact that we aren't always the ultimate authorities on things that people haven't worked on yet. Another question that I think we need to ask is whether or not our job as editors is to have the last word on a subject and shut down discussion, or whether it's our job to have what might be the first word on a passage if we're the first editor in a very long time, or if we're entering an editorial tradition, maybe what we're having is the interim word in a discussion. So are there ways in our annotations that we can open up discussion and leave opportunities for people to do further research or to talk about things in the classroom or resolve them in performance. I also think we need to think about annotations differently for Shakespeare and for other less canonical playwrights. And so the work that we need to do in annotations is likely going to be different if ours is the first and maybe the only edition ever. I think the temptation might be to do a lot of work and try to provide authoritative annotations, but perhaps actually, if we are hoping for further conversations, maybe this is precisely the point to open things up. Okay, so we're almost at 9. Thoughts, feel free to unmute and jump in.
We have 2 comments. One,
Navarre, can you read David's comment there?
yeah. David says, on clarity versus opacity, I have found working with Elizabethan printings of an Edwardian interlude, the typesetter did not understand or misread some expressions that were apparently obscure 10 to 15 years on. Trying to ascertain the original may not establish its meaning, but can show how language was on the move within the history of the text.
That's a great point. Thank you, David. Okay, I'll just quickly show you the resources we have. Chapter 16 of the LEMDO encoding guidelines is entirely about annotations. So I've just pointed you to the link there, and you can search within it for specific topics. Our next webinar is going to be the technical companion to this editorial webinar, and it will be on December 19th at 8 a.m. And SurveyMonkey is back up and running at UVic, so feel free to register using that link. We recognize that it's getting awfully close to the holiday season for many people. We will be recording and transcribing, and so if you're not able to make it on December 19th, you will be able to watch the webinar later. I'll end with thank yous to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding this webinar series, to Navarre Holden for slide design that makes it easy to put together slideshows, to Martin Holmes for our TEI customization, and the Humanities Computing and Media Center at the University of Victoria for site design and hosting. Thank you.